Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is Cuban lawyer and political consultant Luis Carlos Battista. With us from Philadelphia is Michael Johns. He focused on developing countries as a policy analyst for the Heritage Foundation and served as a speechwriter for U.S. President George H.W. Bush. Qinduo Xu is a senior researcher at the Pangoal Institution, a public policy center in Beijing. And Roberta Braga serves as the assistant director of the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsht Latin America Center right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Michael, let me start with you in Philadelphia, and let's talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's what's making news right now. You know, during the election campaign, at that time, candidate Trump was highly critical of the TPP. He called it a disaster. But now he's talking about seeking membership of the TPP. What's prompted this change?
Well, I think the definition of what TPP is ultimately what the change is. I mean, when TPP first came out, it was 30 chapters, thousands of pages, and there were numerous objections that the president identified and that I believe he continues to hold. The opportunity that I think he sees is that that document and the provisions of it are subject to improvement. Additionally, we, I think looked at this as complicated in the sense that multilateral trade agreements of that magnitude are always difficult, and we have individual trade agreements with the lion's share of TPP partners. So I think what's happening now is, an assessment of, gee, can this work for U.S. trade interests? And there's a perception that possibly it can. And he has empowered our trade representative and senior economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, to explore the potential of resolving some of those issues. And I think that's utterly constructive, responsible, and, potentially optimistic.
Michael, I'm wondering, what can be done? Is the U.S. too late to the party here? Because these other member states in the TPP have already forged an agreement.
Well, they have, and not only that, they excluded some of the provisions that would have been favorable to the U.S., so it would require a re-engagement of the U.S. in some degree of negotiating process. Simultaneously, I expect that we're going to look to continue to expand individual bilateral relations in trades, possibly a very major trade agreement with Japan, where that was really one of the primary areas of concern in TPP, where some of the preclusions and difficulties in U.S. exports to Japan could be resolved bilaterally. But I think you have now a kind of a sense to take a fresh look at it, to re-engage TPP partners, say that the U.S. did object to the original document, but with some changes, it might be very suitable. And I think TPP partners, by and large, would like to see the U.S. engage, since every one of them has substantial trade relations with us currently.
Yeah, at least one of the member states, Mexico, late on Friday said that, yes, the U.S. is welcome to join the TPP. But right now, let me go to Qinduo Xu. He is in Beijing, China. And Qinduo, of course, China is not a member of the TPP. But, the prevailing view is that the TPP is going to act as a counterweight to China's economic rise, its rise as an economic power. How will this latest announcement from the United States be seen in China?
Well, from the Chinese side, mostly people would see that, the change of heart of the President Trump is mostly about the profit or the interest he sees from joining or rejoining TPP. Mostly, it's about the farmers' interests, for example, like soybeans, which could be affected because of the looming trade war between the U.S. and China. So if the U.S. can somehow gain the access to the agriculture market, like in Japan and other countries within the TPP, that would be a boost. That would be serving as a buffer zone to reduce the effects from a trade war with China, because there will be additional tariffs on the U.S. soybeans to China. When it comes to the TPP and President Trump, his principle, America first, is always there. So there is welcome from Japan, from other members, but at the same time, you can see the Japanese response is somehow also very mixed. From a Chinese point of view, a lot of people would say this is a countering measure against the rise of China. We don't necessarily see that. We see that as a group of countries they would like to form a trading, like a group, a liberalization group, that's perfectly fine, nothing wrong with that. In general, China supports liberalization of trade.
Okay, Roberto, let's move on to the Summit of the Americas taking place in Lima, Peru. The theme for this year is transparency and anti-corruption. As we heard our correspondent tell us, it's about good governance. And it's come at a very inopportune time, actually, because we just had the president of the host country having to resign because of a corruption scandal. Firstly, how big an issue is this, corruption and transparency?
I think at this moment it is a huge issue, especially with elections in 3 of the major countries and more coming up. I think we're seeing it play out in Brazil, in Mexico, and Colombia. And so this is the moment to address this issue. Whether or not the leaders at the summit are able to do that, many are on their way out, remains to be seen. But I do think we can expect some sort of agreement or declaration coming out of this summit, and I think we need that at this time.
When you say an agreement, will this be something that's legally binding on the member states?
You know, it's hard to say at this point. Yeah. I don't know if the countries can come to a consensus exactly on how to move forward, but I do think that they will try to come out with some sort of statement, declaration, at least to show momentum on this topic. I think if they don't, their populations will see a gap there, and so I do think they have to show some strength here and take this opportunity.
Okay, Luis, the former Cuban leader Fidel Castro was not at the first Summit of the Americas, which took place in Miami in 1994, but Cuba will be at this one. Mm-hmm. Firstly, do you know if President Raul Castro will be there?
So, for what I have said, what I have heard, Cuban President Raul Castro is going, but now the correspondent was saying that Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, who is a foreign minister, is going. Right. So that will be a major shift in Cuba's foreign policy toward the region, because that will be an opportunity to engage again General Raul Castro with other partners in the region, right, especially when treating and discussing the issue of Venezuela. Okay. So Cuba has been always in the side of Venezuela when talking about the political crisis and economic crisis in Venezuela, and I expect it will not change in the short term of this summit.
So yes, they have been close allies, Cuba and Venezuela, but from a political point of view, from a diplomatic point of view, if you like, how significant is the fact that Cuba is going to be there?
It's absolutely a big issue for Cuba. We have seen that so-called civil society, the Cuban civil society, has been already there, and it happened in the first summit that Cuba participated. Again, Cuba wants to engage in the region through this summit, because obviously we have to keep in mind that it's the most important meeting in the Western Hemisphere, and Cuba wants to be part of that, although not being part of the OAS, that is the Organization of American States, and have said that Cuba will not join the OAS again since it was expelled in the 1960s.
Michael, you know, this is the age of shifting alliances, of emerging powers around the world. The headline in the New York Times a few days ago was China fills Trump's empty seat at Summit of the Americas. And if we look at some of the figures, Latin America is now the second largest destination for Chinese investment. And China, according to that New York Times piece, is the largest trading partner of 3 of the region's largest economies. So in a sense, is the US playing catch up here?
Well, I think in Africa and in Latin America, what you've seen is China heavily involved in development programs. Their approach in Latin America has been very distinct from, I think, what the U.S. approach has been traditionally. They are essentially financing major infrastructure programs. And I think as part of that, footnoted that they absolutely do expect to expand their geopolitical influence throughout Latin America, throughout the world. And that's a trend that China is engaged in. The president, I think, is acutely aware of that. The U.S. remains, you know, really the primary relationship for most Latin American countries among superpowers. We do over $1 trillion of trade with Latin America right now. We have individual trade agreements with a good number of countries, and really with the exception of Cuba and Venezuela that stand out as, frankly, tyrannical governments that are bucking the trend of the continent. there's lots of room for optimism about every individual country left in Latin America and the Caribbean, which seems to be increasingly acutely aware of the need for democratic political structures and for market-oriented reforms in their economy. And as they do that, you're seeing, you know, in the case of a good number of them, Brazil, which is the powerhouse, obviously, you know, some real economic influence that's being exerted. And this continues to be a primary source of U.S. exports. I think it comprises a little over a fourth of our total exports. And I think there's a lot of focus. It would be misstated to say that this administration is not engaged in the region or aware of the region. This is the Vice President's second trip to Latin America. There's going to be, I think, a good number of interactions and hosting of events with heads of state. And obviously, we're engaged in trying to renegotiate NAFTA and see if that can be done. If it can't be done, it's going to be torn up. So that's kind of where we are with Mexico. And I think Mexico appreciates the realities that we've confronted in the NAFTA agreement. It has not turned out as it was advertised.